All right, so let's just have a quick check. We've got people joining as we speak. We'll just wait a few minutes for these numbers to roll in. There we go. So just a quick first point, if anyone's got any questions while this is going on as well, feel free to fire them into the Q&A box. My colleague Pierrick is manning the Q&A box, so he will be fielding some bits and pieces to our panelists here. Let's say welcome everyone to our webinar. We're going to go through some of your frequently asked questions on dry hopping and some best practices with our technical team. We've got joining us bright and early from the States. We've got Andy, Spencer, Pat, Blaze, and JT. So thanks for joining us. It's a healthy time in Europe, but I know it's kind of hitting early for you guys. Just going to have a quick chat. Yeah, we've got people joining us right the way through. So my name's Luke. I'm the marketing lead for Europe, and I'm going to be fielding some of the questions to the guys. And for the moment, I am going to hand things over to Spencer to do some quick introductions.
Hey everybody, thanks Luke. My name is Spencer Tilkemeyer. I am the East Division Lead and Brewing Innovations Lead for Yakima Chief, and I'm joined by a group of very capable colleagues here. Andy Arsenault is our Key Accounts Division Lead. JT Wattenberg is our technical brewer based in Yakima. He's the one who actually brews all of our internal batches for R&D research. Pat Jensen is our R&D lab manager. He runs our research and development lab in Yakima. And Blaze Rude is our Key Accounts Director and Director of Brewing Innovations, and he's based in Oregon. So among this group, there's a lot of years of brewing and lab experience. I think half of us are former brewers. Well, most of us are former brewers. Pat's the main one with a lot of lab experience, so he'll help us fill in those gaps there. But all in all, we're really pleased to be here. Thank you everybody for attending. We hope to shed some light on best practices, just things that we can help make beer better, make beer easier to produce, and just make your lives easier all around. So a quick introduction, I'm going to share my screen here and give just a quick introduction to who we are and what we aim to do here. So as I mentioned, we are Yakima Chief Hops. I think most of you probably know us and know these Luke and Pierrick and various others that are spread throughout our team in Europe. Our mission is very simple, to connect family hop farms with the world's finest brewers. That's, of course, all of you. And those family hop farms are spread throughout the Pacific Northwest. We are the only 100% grower-owned hop company. We are owned by 14 grower families, the folks that you see on the screen right now. Those folks actually own the company, and we are proud to represent them in the market. We believe that they grow the finest hops in the world. We also have a breeding arm associated with our company. So Yakima Chief Ranches is the farm quality management and breeding arm of Yakima Chief Hops, formerly known as Select Botanicals Group. They're responsible not only for new varieties and bringing them to market, so from initial pollen cross to eventual market commercialization, but also they're responsible for farm quality management, which assures that every carton of Simcoe, Citra, Mosaic, Warrior that you receive is indeed that same carton of Citra, Simcoe, Mosaic that you've come to know and love. And that consistency and that quality does not happen by accident. It happens because these people spend a lot of their time on their daily routine, making sure that farm quality management is at the forefront of everything that we do. Over the years, Yakima Chief Ranches has brought a lot of very influential varieties to market. You see the timeline below, starting in 1997 with Atanum, which is YCR1. On through the years with Simcoe, Warrior, Palisade, and then later Citra, Mosaic, Equinaut, Laurel, Sabro, and Pato. And most recently, in 2020, in November, we released a new variety called Talus, which a lot of you are familiar with and have used in various beers in the market in Europe. We've had a lot of great feedback about that in Europe. formerly known as HBC 692. It is a daughter of Sabro and a granddaughter of Neo Mexicanus. So very exciting varieties there. A lot of heavy hitters brought to market via YCR over the years. And so what does our R&D team do? Just a very, very brief introduction. This team and a number of others in the Yakima office are responsible for a lot of our research and development that we do surrounding particularly brewing innovations and technical solutions. Those are kind of two sides of the same coin. Really what that means is solving problems for brewers in the market and developing new products and new procedures for brewers to make beer better, to make their lives easier, to make their beer more efficient, things like that. One of our most recent projects has been utilizing some new lab equipment, GC SED and a GC QTOF to take a really focused look at beer soluble compounds. Some of you may have seen this graph before called the survivables graph. This is an internal graph that we've used for couple of years now that has really proven fruitful for a lot of brewers in terms of the way that we examine hops for their eventual solubility in beer. So more to come on that, just a brief introduction into our R&D team and who we are. If you are interested in what we're talking about today and you would like to dig deeper, I would definitely point you towards our virtual harvest website, hopandbrewschool.com. We have lots of videos on this website on dry hopping best practices, survivable compounds, lab procedure and analysis, so many different topics that we did throughout the month of September last year. So a lot of good content there if you'd like to dig a little deeper. Some resources for the people on this call that you can by all means utilize at any time. Hopandbrewschool.com, as I mentioned, is a resource for a lot of video content that we've produced over the past couple of years. And we also have a brewing help desk called brewinghelp@yakimachief.com. All the folks on this call man that help desk, along with a couple of other former brewers that are on staff with us. We aim to get quick responses to questions from customers about brewing questions, brewing procedure, troubleshooting, things like that. And we aim to give you a response time of 24 hours or less, so a really quick turnaround if we can. And so it's proven very fruitful. Please utilize that help desk whenever you see fit. So without further ado, that's a quick introduction to who we are. We're going to kick it back to Luke, and he's going to give us some questions here, and we'll get rolling. So.
Yeah, thanks very much. So obviously with the registration link we sent out, we asked for your frequently asked questions. Pierrick and I have gone through all of them, and there's some absolutely incredible stuff in there, guys. And we've distilled them down to a little hit list of the most asked questions in there. We're going to try and get to any other ones that come through during this session while we're live, time allowing. But without further ado, I'll kick off with the number one asked question. And it's a pretty broad one, I have to say, but it's what are the most efficient dry hopping techniques? Are there any best practices that you guys would suggest?
I can hop on here and chime in a little bit. There's a couple things when you say efficiency. Are you talking about getting the most out of your hops, or are you talking about production efficiency in the brewery? I kind of look at it as one and the same. My personal process, which we have implemented and JT follows in our brewery in Yakima, and we live by this one, is dry hopping a little early, not in the middle of fermentation, but tail end. That helps us get a jump on the VDK mop up that's going to happen after you dry hop. And temperature wise, we definitely like to dry hop warm. So pretty much we don't turn the tank down at all when we dry hop. We kind of budget for the VDK production that's going to happen, and we crash our tanks earlier when we dry hop earlier. So there is some differences in the aroma that you get doing dry hop that way. And so you get a little bit more of the fruity, softer tropical aromas when you dry hop a little early, and less of the piney and like strong citrus, in my opinion. But I'd love to hear what the team on the call says as well.
I'd agree. Yeah, definitely dry hop warm. I think I tend to dry hop between 60 Fahrenheit and 67 Fahrenheit. So that would be about 15 to 19 degrees Celsius. Be sure that your yeast is healthy if you are going to do an active dry hop with some of that yeast still in, because it is going to react with those hops a little bit. And with that, if you are going to do an active dry hop as well, be sure to harvest your yeast beforehand, because after that, it's really not going to have much use with all those hop compounds in there if you are going to try to repitch that yeast. But definitely time, leave it on there, throw it on, towards the tail end of that fermentation, throw those hops in, don't leave them on the beer too long, try to get them dumped off after 2 or 3 days of being on hops, or else you're going to pull a little bit of that vegetal. But yeah, I really enjoy doing an active dry hop more so than the post.
Yeah, like JT mentioned, I'd say also, yeah, I can't second enough dumping the trub soon, and then especially after you crash the tank and more flocks to the bottom, get it out of there, because otherwise you're going to start to get leaching woody flavors. So yeah, I would agree with that feedback.
The only thing I wanted to add briefly with what JT just said, that quicker contact time is what we recommend. Really, we have some charts that show like nothing after really day 2 is anything positive is happening. In some cases, some of those oils are actually decreasing a little bit. So the quicker you can get the hops off the beer, in my experience, the better. And then the other thing is that, dissolved oxygen. Oxygen is bad. You can dry hop the most efficient way, but if you have high DO, it's going to ruin your beer. So what I recommend for any brewery is to get a DO meter. If you want to stand out in a really crowded market, you have to have those DO numbers at the bare minimum for dry hopping and then for your finished product.
Yeah, I would echo everything that everybody said here. I kind of, when I thought about this question ahead of time, broke it down into 4 points, which was warm temperature, short contact time, healthy yeast, use cryo when possible, right? So in terms of efficiency, cryo, just by its sheer mass reduction, is going to absorb less beer. So in terms of being able to yield more beer and have a more efficient sort of grain to glass yield, and be able to package more beer, cryo can definitely help cut down on some of those substantial yield losses. The one thing that I just wanted to underscore a little bit is the healthy yeast thing. That's not necessarily intuitive to every brewer, because it's not necessarily a traditional thing that people paid attention to. Back when people were only producing West Coast IPAs that had 1 pound per barrel dry hop, something like that, dry hopping very late when the beer was very, very inactive and there was very low yeast counts, that was fine and it worked very well. With the way that people dry hop these days, when you're getting up into 4, 5, 6, up 10 pounds per barrel range, we find that there's the potential for some concentration of some less enjoyable compounds when dry hopping at those rates without the presence of some healthy yeast. Healthy yeast can actually help gas off some of those compounds and make them less soluble and less likely to end up in the finished beer. So just like Blaze said, I would recommend not waiting until the beer is like completely attenuated and essentially dead. I would try to do your dry hops either in active firm or at the very tail end of active firm, where there's very little activity left to go, but the yeast is still doing some cleanup and is still very healthy and active. So pay attention to those yeast counts and try to do it early and limit that contact time.
Yeah, I'll chime in too on don't confuse the short contact time with crashing early. You really shouldn't crash your tank until the VDK is gone. And like Spencer and the team were saying, getting the hops in a little bit early, it's kind of coinciding. You're dry hopping while you're doing your VDK rest, and there's a little bit more VDK getting produced. So there's no reason, if you're going to dry hop warm, there's no reason to do a VDK rest and then dry hop and then do another VDK rest. Just get it all done at the same time. One other note, so with short contact time, how do you get those hops to flock down? Well, if you're not turning your tank down, you need to add some pressure. If you add some pressure to your tank, you're going to get that trub settling into the cone. You're going to be able to get most of it out, and then you can warm age the beer until the VDK is gone. And that's what we do, all the time here in Yakima.
Yeah, a couple more points. Andy brought up a good point when it comes to O2. Obviously, O2 gets introduced during a dry hop. There's kind of no way around it. There's a couple things I've liked to do just to kind of avoid that as much as possible. I'll dump off all my yeast, get all that ready, and then by the time I am going up to my top of the fermenter, I will give a little CO2 blanket just over the top, 2 psi, nothing big, not enough to where you're blowing off your cap when you're trying to open it up. But that seems to hold in a little bit of that CO2 a bit and avoid letting in any of that O2 from the outside.
So one question just come into the chat, which is probably a good point to bring this in, and that someone has asked, would you do active dry hopping if you weren't adding if you were adding to tanks that aren't pressure rated?
I just sent a response back through the chat, but I don't see that as an issue, Will. I think you can definitely do active firm dry hop in a non-pressure rated tank. You just, as Blaze said, you might not get the same, rapidity of sort of settling. Your settling might be a little slower, but I do think you could definitely still do an active firm dry hop in a non-pressure rated tank. Obviously, one caveat that we should give, a big caveat for this entire conversation, is if you're doing active firm dry hop, please be really, really cognizant of the safety risks. Hop gushers are an especially high possibility, high likelihood when you're dry hopping an active fermenting beer. So there are many, many positive flavor benefits, in our opinion, to active firm dry hopping, but there are risks involved as well. So please, if you're on top of a ladder and you're dry hopping an active firm beer, be extremely cognizant of the amount of gas that's coming out of that beer and whether it might potentially have the potential to spew up into your face and knock you off the ladder, anything like that. So just to give that sort of caveat for the entire conversation, it has a lot of positive benefits in the beer, but just please, be safe while you do it. So.
Yeah, a method around that would be to dump maybe 10% of your dose in, cap the tank, leave the dry hop or the airlock open and let it kind of go wild. And then once it's chilled out, then add the rest. But I'd like to do it fast if I'm in a big tank.
Cool. I'll fill one more quickly from the chat as well. And this is, when you say the tail end of fermentation, how many gravity points are you thinking?
I'd say about 2 to 3 away from what you would think your first terminal would be if you didn't dry hop it. That's usually, so what JT is usually around 4.5, 5, 4.5.
Yeah, around 4.5, 5 Plato. Usually an average has been about 2 days before I'm expecting to reach my terminal. It's kind of been the sweet spot for me.
Yeah, to contrast that with like what we would call like an active firm dry hop, I would usually classify that as something like 4 to 8 points left to go in your in your fermentation. Generally speaking, we're kind of shooting for something like six Plato left to go in fermentation would be a good spot to do your active firm dry hop. You could do it even earlier. Some people do. We've not necessarily gone down the rabbit hole of developing a method based on cell counts or anything like that, but 6 degrees Plato left to go seems to be a nice sweet spot that works for a lot of different systems and setups and things like that. So.
Cool, awesome. I'm going to jump onto the next question on here, and this is one that we've had a lot through the FAQs on this one, and you guys touched on very briefly earlier. And this is just, what are the differences for dry hopping purposes between whole cone, T90, and of course Cryo Hops?
Say available lupulin, how easy is it to get to? And whole cone, not very easy, not very efficient to dry hop with. T90, pretty good if you want some polyphenol. It's got that, it's got the lupulin, and then Cryo, obviously a little bit more concentrated, a lot more concentrated. So when used right, you can kind of really control how grassy your beer is, in my opinion, and lower your hop creep and VDK, production post dry hop.
I've only dry hopped with whole flower once when I was home brewing, and I'll never do it again, because you can just right away how much beer gets absorbed in, and you can't get the hops out. And then you kind of go T90 is the next step, absorbs a little more if we're talking about yield. And then Cryo, you can really save on yield by dry hopping with Cryo.
And obviously Cryo just has a lot less of the green matter that comes with whole cone or T90 as well. So with a Cryo, say in a dry hop, you're going to get a lot more of those really fruity kind of citrus or whatever you're really going for, and less of that green vegetal flavor or smell that you're really going for from a whole cone or a T90.
Yeah, I've really been preferring the balance of some T90 in the hot side, maybe a little T90 in the dry hop, but mostly Cryo in the dry hop. It just seems to flock better and take up less of that, that beer in the fermenter, and just for production efficiency and quality, it's definitely help me get the flavors in my beers.
Totally, and as Andy kind of mentioned earlier too, one of the benefits of cryo as well is you can use 1 pound of that to every 2 pounds you would normally use of a T90. So with our yields, you're seeing less hop loss, you're seeing just larger yields in general, and then on top of that, less storage space, less shipping costs, less cleanup in the kettle, in the whirlpool, which is always nice as a brewer. There's a lot of benefits to going with that cryo route towards a dry hop as well. I really, really prefer it.
I would also point out too, I mean, I know that utility costs are higher in Europe than they are in the United States, but it's that's a consideration in the United States as well. Cryo, you basically have to store half as many cartons in your cold storage, which is not to be, ignored in places with, small cold storage space, high utility rates, things like that. So having to store that much less material in your cold room is a pretty big advantage as well. And obviously shipping costs are diminished as well. But I agree with what the guys said. I do really appreciate a balance of T90 and cryo in a dry hop. I've found that something like 20 to 30% T90 and roughly 70% cryo is a really nice ratio. It tends to leave a little bit of that tannic sort of snap on the tongue from the T90, but it cleans up a ton of it sort of refines the flavor profile of the dry hop. And it tends to yield way, way better than a 100% T90 dry hop bill would. So a lot of advantages there. We also find that the cryo process can help refine some of the good flavors in certain hops, right? There's some, there's no chemical change that's happening during the cryo process, but the removal of some of that plant material can sometimes sort of like refine and enhance the good flavors in particular hops. I would say Equinaut is a great example of that. It just tends to really shine in the cryo format. There's others that fall into that category too. So yeah, worth using both. I would say both types for a variety that you think just to see if you maybe get different expressions by using the different product types. So.
Cool.
Yeah, I'll chime in a little bit more on that. Is with the cryo process, essentially that plant material that we remove also has some smeared lupulin on it, which isn't really necessarily the most stable as compared to what's kind of protected by the leaf near the stem. So that's really what we focus on, is getting the lupulin that hasn't been smeared or messed with too much. So yeah, like Spencer said, it refines it and makes it a little more pure and I would say a little more predictable.
Cool. I've got a couple of really quick questions in from the chat that I'll post on here. One is asking, is there less VDK with cryo?
That's kind of like a more complex function, I would say. There's generally speaking, and we'll probably talk about this a little bit when we get to hop creep, but I would say it's not necessarily less VDK with cryo. It's less potential for hop creep, which could cause VDK, right? So it's like there's a sort of like a transitive property there. It's cryo, because it has a diminished amount of leaf material, is generally going to introduce less enzymes. Because most of the enzymes that are going to cause additional fermentation are going to be residing in the leaf. It's not 100% of the case of the time, but most of them are. So by reducing the amount of leaf that you're putting into your beer, you can potentially reduce the amount of hop creep that you're seeing. Therefore, you are probably going to see a smaller VDK spike as a result of that additional fermentation than you would if you were using all T90. So in a way, yes, that's true. Cryo could be less VDK, but it's because of less hop creep. So I hope that maybe that clarifies.
Cool. And another one, which is a question about whole cones, and that's, do you have the risk of adding more oxygen when you're using whole cone versus any kind of pellet?
You definitely do. And a big part of that is just the fact that there's just more space in a whole cone. They're less tightly packed. That's kind of a big advantage to pelleting, is that you can kind of compact all that and hold it, holding that shelf life a little bit.
Cool, perfect. Well, I mean, you guys have talked about hop creep, which we'll get onto in a second. But another question that we've had quite a lot come up, which is what's the best way to avoid hop burn in a finished beer?
This one, I think, is just
time and temperature.
Yep. Yeah, patience. Unfortunately, it's really just letting it crash a little bit longer, holding off that extra day if you need to. Sensory is a really, really big part of picking that up. If you have a good sensory team, that can go a long, long way. just having people be like, there's still a little bit of that scratch. Let's give it another day, but really just patience, time, and temp.
I just want to add a couple things to that as well, is that adding more finings to the kettle can sometimes help with the protein break. If you're doing like hazier IPAs, you tend not to add a lot of, say, whirlflock. But if you're getting a lot of hop burn, you want to get that protein out of the kettle. Maybe you want to increase your whirlflock. Another way is to add some biofine, like some finishing product, to your bright tank. If you want to package your beer sooner, if there is hop burn, and then maybe do a multi-stage dry hop instead of a single stage dry hop to get some of the initial hops out of the beer. Could help with decreasing hop burn. And then my last one is proper pitching rates for yeast. If you're adding too much yeast and you're making a hazier IPA, you're going to have more yeast in suspension. It's going to interact with the hops, and it's going to create a much sharper burn. But if you get those cell counts to where whatever your manufacturer recommends, I typically do 1 million cells per milliliter per degree Plato for my hazy IPAs, and I don't really have an issue with hop burn.
I mean, cellar procedure also has a lot to do with this. Andy kind of pointed some of that out. Obviously, if you have a centrifuge, there's the ability to spin that quickly and get a lot of that hot material out. That can reduce hop burn. Not everybody's going to have that capability, though. That's so. If specialized equipment is not available to you, I would agree with exactly what the guy said. Time and temperature is going to be the best. Oftentimes, even a matter of 1 to 2 days can be the difference between a really, really sharp, stinging beer and a really beautiful beer. So be patient. As much as these beers tend to be really quick turnaround and they need to be fresh and we want to get them out to consumers as fast as possible, sometimes that extra 1 or 2 days is the difference between a good beer and a great beer. So I would say be patient if you need to be to make sure that it's right. So.
Cool. Well, I think the next one on the list, and it's something that we've touched on, obviously, is about hop creep. So I'll kick off with what exactly is hop creep?
I'll take a stab at that one. If you that hop creep is, I believe that the official definition is re-fermentation induced by the addition of dry hops into a finished or almost finished beer. Basically, what it is there are enzymes present that reside mostly in the leaf of the hop, the bract material. Not completely, but mostly. And they have the potential to take starches and sort of limit dextrins that are present in a wort that would previously be unfermentable by yeast, so things that the yeast would normally leave behind, and further convert them into fermentable sugars. So what that does is it takes a beer that is theoretically at terminal already, it's stopped fermenting, you add dry hops, and now all of a sudden it kickstarts a small amount of fermentation again. The reason why it can be really problematic is because that additional fermentation can sometimes take a very long time, so if you think your beer's done and you're almost ready to package it, and then you dry hop it and it takes an additional 7 days or so to complete that fermentation, that slow burn of fermentation, that can be a big challenge for a brewery because that's going to really slow down your production schedule. On top of that, as we mentioned, it can also have an additional negative effect of VDK production, which can throw off some bad, flavors in the beer. It can also take your beer out of spec. If you wanted it to finish at 4 Plato and now all of a sudden it finishes at 2.8, that's a very different beer at that point. It's both stronger and less sweet. So there's a number of reasons why it's a big hassle. We'll get to the group's sort of assessment of how to attack it. I think my opinion on it is there's no single magic bullet solution. In most cases, there's the solution to hop creep is going to be a multi-pronged approach, and it's going to take sort of a number of different monitoring of cellar procedures to really attack it and make sure that it doesn't become an issue downstream. So.
Yeah, and hop creep is really it's pretty fairly new phenomenon that we're really noticing, and it's kind of come about with. No, it's not. I apologize, but it seems like it's just been like with
it's
the higher
old, but recently more popular to study, I guess. Is
totally, yeah.
Because dosing is when dry hop dosing gets bigger. It's
paper. 1893 was the first paper written on hop creep.
Oh, wow. But maybe it's just a little more prevalent now that the dosing rates are going up. It's starting to be a little bit more out there. You're starting to see a little bit more of it.
Yeah, I like to think of it. Just one more thing, Luke. I just like to think of it, like Spencer said, with your gravity readings kind of decreasing when you dry hop. They're just creeping lower and lower and lower, because so you can kind of like think of it when you're talking about hop creep, just with your gravity readings decreasing after that dry hop. And then another thing is, I think all yeast, different yeast will produce different levels of hop creep, and I've seen in my experience. So if you're getting hop creep with one yeast, maybe switch it out to a different one, and that will sometimes mitigate. Hop creep will still occur, but it could mitigate how long that tail is.
Yeah, I would say a highly attenuating yeast like California ale, which is commonplace here in the US, it tends to chomp through more of those harder to ferment fermentables that are pretty much unlocked for it after a big dry hop dose. If you're dry hopping 3 pounds a barrel of T90, you're gonna add some sugar to your beer. That was starch before, or dextrins, like Spencer said. But yeah, yeast health is huge in terms of time. Like I generally think if you're using the same yeast strain, it just might take longer. If your yeast isn't as healthy, you're getting towards the end of the generations you want to use. That's going to influence how long it is, and you might need to refresh your culture. But yeah, just yeast health, nutrient, oxygen when you pitch the yeast is super important to make sure that it's gonna roll through and deal with it. And then yeah, temperature. Yeah, you do not want in the wintertime having cold fermenters. We've had to add some heaters to our brewery to keep it stable so that we can maintain that fermentation temperature and not be kind of halfway cold crashing because the yeast chill out. So there's a lot of factors, but yeah, like really the definition of hop creep is breaking down those sugars and adding fermentables. But how you deal with it really depends on what you got going on in your brewery.
It's also worth noting too that that wort composition is a huge factor in the way that hop creep presents itself. So a beer that's mashed for a really dry, a really sort of beta amylase favoring sort of a mash schedule is going to produce a drier beer, and is therefore going to be substantially less subject to dry hop creep, just because there's not nearly so many dextrins hanging out available to be converted, right? Whereas a lot of hazy IPA worts that are mashed, with a more alpha amylase favoring mash schedule, they're going to tend to favor create a more substantially risky environment for hop creep, I guess is one way to put it. So just remain cognizant of that. You can control some of this in the mash tun. Granted, that may change the profile of your beer, so it might not be something that you're willing to do. But yeah, there's a substantial amount of control that can be had there. As somebody also asked in the chat, can you reduce hop creep more by dry hopping earlier into fermentation? Yes, absolutely. That is one great strategy for reducing dry hop creep. Granted, your character of the dry hop is going to be different when it's done early versus late, right? So it's not necessarily a perfect one-to-one substitution. That being said, we are big believers in active firm dry hop. There's a lot of reasons why it tends to produce really high quality beer. Not necessarily as a 100% substitution to active or to post firm dry hop, but as an accompaniment to. But yes, you can sort of, if you want to look at it this way, you can kind of do the damage early of hop creep and then have it clean up faster because you're still in the middle of active fermentation. So that's definitely a strategy that you can take. Healthy yeast, as we said, is a big part of this, because yeast that's kind of tending to crap out at the end of fermentation is not going to do a good job of cleaning up that hop creep quickly. So a healthy, vigorous yeast strain is gonna do it much better and reduce the amount of time that it takes to get it done.
Hey, Spencer, can you clarify something for the group here? When you say reduce hop creep, you really are probably meaning that you're gonna mop up the VDK faster, not really change that final gravity.
No. So that's a good clarification, Blaze. Yes, it's just going to happen faster. And so essentially the damage in terms of it that it does to your schedule, right, of having to take maybe 2 or 3 extra days rather than 7 extra days is lessened, right? The gravity drop that you're going to get is probably going to happen no matter what. It's because the amount of enzymes that are present are probably going to just do that for you. So some people plan for it. Some people know that their beers are going to creep, you know, half a degree Plato every time. So they just mash a little bit higher and try to get the beer to finish a little bit higher, and then assume that, you know, the creep is going to drop it that little bit further. Like I say, some of it's unfortunate that we, you know, I wish we could offer this magic bullet to everybody here that's like, this is what you do and you solve your issue, right? Unfortunately, it does involve I think a number of different solutions, and each brewery is a little different. A combination of solutions: yeast health, pay attention to the way you mash, and then make sure that you're favoring warm temperatures to try to get that cleaned up quickly at the end of fermentation. So there are also products that have a tendency to minimize the VDK production during the end of fermentation. I can't remember what the product is called, but we have had some people that have had success with that in the past. So that's something to maybe consider as well.
That product is ALDC enzyme. That's a product that I've used in the past that helps mitigate that VDK spike during dry hopping.
Somebody just put in the chat, I think something that brings up a really good point that we ought to address quickly, which is, I think somebody asked this, or we have this question later in the thing, but I think we should probably address it in the context of hop creep, which is the potential of using a lower temperature dry hop as a solution for hop creep. And I would just like to say that's definitely, in our experience, not a solution. It really, all it does is just you essentially kick the problem down the road. If you dry hop at a cold temperature, it's one of the reasons why we recommend warm dry hop. It has multiple benefits, but one of the main reasons is if you dry hop at 50 Fahrenheit, which is, I think, something like 10 Celsius, you're still doing that enzymatic conversion, right? Those starches are still being converted into simpler sugars. You just don't have a vigorous enough yeast activity at that point to actually convert those sugars into, you know, to actually ferment them and make sure that the beer is dried out. So what you end up with is a product that you package down the road that still has unfermented sugars in it, and potentially has the possibility for over attenuation in package. So you could end up with exploding cans or exploding bottles or overcarbonated beer, all these other really problematic things down the road. So very much do not recommend colder temperature dry hopping at high hopping rates. There are scenarios in which brewers are able to execute it effectively. I don't consider it worth the risk. That's my own opinion. That's purely mine. Many brewers can do it well. I just don't think it's worth the risk for that additional attenuation and the inability to actually clean up that sugar once it's converted. So that's my 2 cents. I would try to dry hop at fermentation temperature if at all possible. So.
I'll chime in and say the flavor profile and aroma profile you get dry hopping colder is going to change versus warm too. You tend to get more in that like woody range, vegetal range at colder temperatures in my experience and my sensory. I mean, I've messed around with dry hopping cask beers and putting them in the cooler and messing around with them, and generally it just doesn't match my preference. And like Spencer said, shelf stability. I mean, if you're filtering and sure there isn't anything in your final packaged product, you might be able to get away with it and turn the beer faster, but overall I think it's going to get you eventually, and it's going to be a problem.
Yeah, the good hop oils that you're looking for take longer to extract during a cold fermentation. So that's why, as Blaze said, you'll get more woody notes, because those, you know, the linalool, the geraniol you're looking, that won't extract as fast with the cold temperatures. But the warmer temperatures, like we said, you could extract those, and maybe as early as 1 day.
On that, is there kind of a minimum dry hopping time that you'd say? Like, is there a bottom limit? And I know we've talked about there being an upper limit for it, but is there a minimum?
I think 24 hours is the minimum that I've used when I've brewed, and that's what I've read about as well. I would say, just when you're doing this, just take notes, take detailed notes. If you want to try it a day, try it a day. But for me, I wouldn't go over that day 3 mark. I think nothing good happens after day 3.
Well, one thing to say, I'll say on that, in my experience, usually like the implications like VDK wise, after you dry hop, it usually takes about 2 to 3 days for that peak VDK to come. So if you dry hop and you're like, check it after a day and you don't smell any VDK and you crash your beer, you're going to be in the same boat of leaving unfermentables in there. I'd say you don't want to crash your beer for at least probably, I don't know, we're like 5 days normally, at least in our brewery. And that's with us dry hopping a little early. So yeah, you're going to know it's going to happen and monitor it. And different yeast strains are different, but yeah, you definitely want the gravity to stabilize and no VDK. But yeah, dump the trub. I'm in agreement with everybody. Dumping it after like 2 days. Start dumping trub. Then once you crash it again, dump everything you can.
Yeah, I actually think if you had the ability to run your brewery in the middle of the night, probably 12 hours, if you have good contact time, is probably going to get you everything you need in your dry hops. Most people don't want to have to go into their brewery in the middle of the night and dump hops after 12 hours, right? So I agree with Andy. 24 hours is probably a safe minimum. One other thing that just got brought up in the chat too that I think is worth mentioning about hop creep. People often ask us, like, what is the cause of hop creep? Why do we see it now when we never saw it before? Or, you know, there's all number of questions that come up on that level. Is it something that we're doing to the hops? Is it something that growers are doing to hops, right? We get questions like that all the time. There's a substantial amount of thought that probably these enzymes are not probably, these enzymes are naturally present in hops, right? They show up naturally just via sort of the growth process naturally within the plant. The question is, where are they denatured, right? Where are they, eliminated from being a major consideration? So we do get people that ask us, like, because we kiln at lower temperatures now, we do kiln at lower temperatures than we used to maybe 20 years ago. Is that the reason why hop creep is more prevalent now? I think hop creep is probably more prevalent just as a feature of the sheer quantity of hops that people are using now. We're hopping at such high rates that the amount of enzymes going into a beer is much higher. There is some reason to believe, though, that lower kiln temperatures actually might have something to do with it. That being said, lower kiln temperatures are also thought to be heavily influential in the reason why hops are so high quality these days, right? We kiln at low temperatures because it maintains the oil integrity and resists a lot of the negative effects of heating in a kiln. So there's a trade-off there, and it's my hunch that most brewers probably would not want us to go back to kilning at hot temperatures. We do need to do more trials on that, but hot temperature kilning is something that we moved away from because we felt that the hops were more high quality from an aromatic standpoint by kilning at lower temperatures. So there's more to sort of suss out there over time, but that's right now I would say hop creep is sort of like something that you treat the symptoms, not necessarily something that we have a root cause for, if that makes sense. So.
I'll add, in our processing too, we respect those hops all the way through, trying to not cook off the oils or change the oils by getting them hot. I mean, T90, we are running less than 100 Fahrenheit, and we monitor that, and we cool our pellet dyes and our pellet mills to help keep those oils in so the brewers can use them. So we're definitely not denaturing them in our processing, either on the cryo line or T90. So not everybody does that. I mean, a T90 isn't exactly a T90. It depends on where it was processed, what their specs are, and how they process it. And we like to do it cold so that maximum oil content's in there, and it's not changed from what the growers deliver to us. We do the best we can.
Real quick chime in. Like I said in kind of the beginning, that in 1893 was the first paper of hop creep. So hop creep's always been around, and killing the enzymes through via killing, it does kind of bring them down to a certain extent, but doesn't alleviate it all the way. So it's not the most effective choice to take, is to kiln it out, to basically denature the enzymes, because you're going to have to hit temperatures like 170 or 180 for a few minutes. So it's really going to probably do more damage than good to really try to do it that way.
Cool. Well, I think I'm gonna jump one of the questions that we've got on the list later on, because it's a little bit more pertinent here. So we've had a lot of talking about kind of the best temperatures for dry hopping, kind of to avoid that hop creep. But obviously we talked about the significant changes, but are there any specific yeast strains that are kind of better and more kind of effective? Like, does that kind of ideal temperature change versus what yeast strain you're using?
We played around in our brewery, and I've historically always used American Ale. So I use 1056, White Lab 001. think it's available worldwide. And that tends to creep a lot because it's very fermentable, but it's a very versatile yeast for a house strain, which is why I liked it. We have switched to a German like Kolsch strain in our brewery, and we've liked the results. I think it just kind of, some of the esters fit better, and the overall VDK spike that we perceive is a little bit less. That said, the creep and the final gravities are pretty consistent. JT, why don't you chime in on that? We've had a lot of batches under our belt together there. And
yeah, I've still never really dropped any lower than about 60 degrees Fahrenheit to do a dry hop, even with that Kolsch yeast. I'll ferment it a little bit colder just at the start, and then ramp it up a little bit higher around day 2, day 3 of fermentation. But even then, I've never really dropped any lower than 60 to 62 on a dry hop. It's kind of about where I've been, even with that Kolsch.
His final gravity stayed pretty consistent between the two in our trials, right?
Yeah, totally consistent. We've been hitting our numbers pretty much consistently on that. So, and it's been pretty consistently at 60 degrees, about 4 or 5 days of a VDK rest, of a diacetyl rest, and it's like clockwork. We've been hitting it.
Andy, what do you got to say on this? I know you played around with more hazies and hazy strains that aren't as attenuative.
Yeah, so I guess when I first started brewing, I definitely had an issue with hop creep because I was dry hopping, day after I would harvest yeast, day 7, day 8, and then I would see a huge tail. Since I've learned from that and I dry hop a little earlier, hop creep definitely decreases. But I'm constantly switching yeast. I was constantly switching yeast as well. I saw a little more hop creep in the Conan Vermont strain because it does tend to dry. It's a lot more attenuative than your London Fog or your London 3 strain. And I've had the best success with those strains, the London Fog, the London 3, for my hazy New England IPAs. For whatever reason, I'll dry hop day 4, day 5 with 2 Plato left at like that 70 degrees. And there's very little hop creep. And my beers have, 30% unmalted grain in there as well. So maybe a day or two, I'll dry hop for 3 days. I'll let it sit for 2 days, repeat, and then I'll crash like day 6. And those beers are finishing at like 4.5 Plato, maybe sometimes 5 Plato, and nothing, cans don't explode. I don't get any VDK spike. So I've had a lot of success with London Fog or London 3 strain.
Awesome. Well, I think kind of staying on the temperature side of things, but kind of moving away from the hop creep a little bit. We've had a couple of questions on specific techniques and specific yeast strains to see if there's kind of a difference with tackling the dry hopping. One of them is with using wild yeast strains, so something like Kvike, for example, is one of the ones that people have been talking about. And another one that we've had a couple of people asking about is how it's best to tackle dry hopping a lager, so something at lagering temperatures.
I don't have any experience with Kvik or any wild yeast, unfortunately, so I can't really speak to that personally. I know that there are people that believe that some wild strains, potentially some bacterial strains, have the potential for a lot of biotransformative activity and could potentially really enhance some of those flavors. I can't speak to that at all. I know there's some literature out there on that, so I would recommend that you maybe do some digging on literature if you want to take a look at that. Related to dry hopping the lager, it's a challenging thing. I would say that it's to be done with care. As we mentioned before, cold dry hopping has its challenges. Since the way I always produce lagers, I didn't dry hop many of them, but the ones that I did, I was always, fermenting from 52 to 54 Fahrenheit, and then allowing the beer to get up to somewhere around 58 to 60 by the end of fermentation to help reduce sulfur production or to clean up some sulfur in any potential diacetyl. If you're going to dry hop a lager, I would recommend doing it at that stage and once again, trying to minimize your contact time. So trying to, lager fermentation is relatively cool, but try to do it at the warmest cool temperature that you can, if that makes sense, to try to minimize the potential for any diacetyl production. You may also have to give that beer a little extra time than you would an ale to get it to clean up any VDK or diacetyl that might that might form during that time, just because lager yeast has a tendency to clean that stuff up more slowly than ale yeast does. So I'm not a huge dry hop lager fan. I'll be honest. That's not really. I think there's risks to it, and I don't know that it tends to translate as well in a lager. I love lagers. Don't get me wrong. I'm a huge lager fan, but if you are going to do it, like I say, try to do it at the warmest temperature you can, and try to make sure that you give it extra time. I recommend that everybody, if they're producing lagers, gets in the habit of doing forced diacetyl tests on every single batch. If that's not something you already do in your brewery, I would say please implement that. You will really benefit yourself by doing forced diacetyl tests. For those people like myself who are not super diacetyl sensitive, lagers can be really hard to detect, like some of the, potential diacetyl in there, or even some of the, obviously the VDK precursors that aren't converted into diacetyl yet. So that forced diacetyl test can really help point out any potential flaws that you might see downstream. So anyway, that's my recommendation for producing lagers for sure. Dry hop with care. So
I just have one recommendation for dry hopping lagers. Exactly what Spencer said. I like to dry hop when we turn the temperature up when you're doing a lager. So you'll dry hop at 50, whatever, 52. And then as soon as you hit that like high Krausen mark or peak fermentation, say around like 7 Plato, you turn the temperature up to like 55. And then that's when I like to hit it, 55, 56. Then I like to hit it with, a very light hand of hops, pound per barrel, maybe less. And then make sure the temperature turns up a little bit, and then that will help clean up the diacetyl a little more. But I've had a lot of success with dry hopping lagers doing that process.
Awesome. Right. So I'm going to jump onto the next question that we've got on our list from the advanced ones. So we've got a few people. I know this has been kind of touched on here a little bit earlier, which is kind of what are the advantages to using cryo hops over T90 pellets for dry hopping? Is it purely aromatics, or is it a yield thing as well?
I'm going to say that it's both. I mean, initially when we created cryo, it was all about producing a really clean, really potent dry hop product to improve quality. And this is stem back. I used to brew, and man, some of my older recipes, I mean, my procedures weren't perfect. They're changed now, but dry hop and heavy would get grassy for my taste. So in addition to just choosing the right varieties, we looked down the path of finding a product that could minimize that. So for me, it's mostly a quality thing, but I mean, in our little brewery in Yakima, I mean, I'm all about aromatic quality, but if I was still running and owning a brewery, I would be very concerned about how much beer is going down the drain. So I think honestly, the benefits are both. And again, I'll reiterate, I wouldn't replace all T90. I'd replace most of it. And I like to keep for a hoppy beer about, we'll call it a little, maybe 0.4 kilos per hectoliter in European units there for your crew. But I'd like to keep that much T90 in the beer, and then shoot, you can go wild with more cryo in there, but you got to kind of have that base vegetal background, but just a little bit. You don't really need that much. I mean, some of our favorite recipes that we've honed in, and shoot, JT chime in. Yeah, well, like Spencer said earlier, if we're doing, 2 kilo per hectoliter brew, a big, we're only going to use 25% T90, and the rest of it, cryo would take up the rest of it. So, and like we said before, it's, we use about half as much cryo as we would T90, and we're seeing aromatic intensity in the same realm, just cleaner.
Yep, I'd agree. The aromas of it are just incredible. I love the just the flavors that it'll give off. And then, yeah, like Blaze mentioned, we mentioned a little earlier, there really is just practicality to the cryo as well. The yields are better. Everything just kind of really comes out a little bit cleaner, but we have found that that sweet spot of 10 to 25% of T90 in there. If you are losing a little bit of that, just like a little bit of that hop bite that you're looking for in an IPA, that extra little bit of T90 really kind of comes into play pretty well.
Cool, that's awesome. I'm gonna jump over to the next one. So what are the differences with some of the advanced products that we hear people talking about? And are there any specific benefits towards dry hopping with them?
I think that's a Pat question through and through.
That's why I got invited. It's advanced. Well, advanced products generally you don't dry hop. In fact, well, you can dose them late post fermentation for some of them, but they're not meant for flavoring outside of bitterness. But to start off with advanced products, there's several different types. Our first one is IKE. IKE is basically just the isomerization of the alpha in CO2 extract. And so it's basically potentially the same as CO2 extracts, just all the alpha has been isomerized. So you'll get a better utilization when you use it in the kettle for isoalpha acids or bitterness, where you get like 65%. CO2 extract would be at 35% utilization. So if you late kettle or whirlpool addition of the IKE, you can get a little more of the aroma to pull over into your final beer if you do it at that time. And then from that, we kind of can lay out the advanced products. And advanced products is generally, I guess I should define it as things that are derived from CO2 hop extract. So after we've made the CO2 hop extract, we would basically enhance the products from there. And so after IKE, what you can do is separate it. Now you'd want to separate the beta and oil, which makes a hop aroma addition that you could put late kettle or early addition into your kettle for defoaming aid, but late kettle for aroma. And that contains all the beta acids and oil from the original CO2 hop extract. Then from there, we create the bittering components, which we separate the isomerized alpha, and we basically standardize it into a 30% solution, which would be ISO. Great for post-fermentation additions, where you can get almost 90% utilization to correct for BUs that you may have missed in your original recipe. Also, other bittering components is rho, tetra, and hexa, but they also serve other purposes. They can be used for bittering, but rho, tetra, and hexa are also light, stable components so you could actually use in clear packaged or green bottle beers and not have the skunky flavor come through, because they do not form 3-MBT because of the nature of their chemical composition. And you could also have foam stability products such as tetra and hexa, which actually add foam stability if you use it due to the nature of their composition. There's pluses and minuses to all of them, but hopefully that kind of wraps up the different ones. If you have further questions, go ahead.
To kind of sum up Pat's point too, there are a number of products that people have tried over the years to to result in sort of like an advanced product, that you can use on the cold side. We have worked on a number of those over the years and continue to work on them. At this point, we've never found one quite yet that we feel like is something that we really feel delivers the quality that we hoped it would, or hope it would. And so we currently don't offer anything in a liquid format that can be used as a cold side aroma addition. We do still think that cryo is pretty much the gold standard in that area if you want to add aroma on the cold side while reducing your yield losses. That doesn't say that in the future we won't be able to produce something that could fit into that space. But at this time, as Pat mentioned, most of the advanced products that we produce are intended for either treatment of light stability or bitterness additions later on down the road, and not so much intended for aroma additions in the cold side. So.
Cool, that's awesome. Right, so this is where the temperature point would have come in, but we jumped that. So I'm going to jump right over to it's something that's came up a lot in the pre-question, come up quite a lot in the chat as well, and that's about biotransformation and survivable compounds. So I'll go with what is biotransformation?
Speaking, I'm gonna. If Pat frowns at me here, that means that I've used the wrong definition. But just very generically speaking, it's an organism converting one compound into another, or one chemical into another. So in this case, for a brewing definition, I got a thumbs up from Pat, so that's good. A brewing definition would be the ability of yeast to metabolize certain compounds within the fermentation process and convert them into other compounds potentially. The reason why brewers are interested in this is that there's a thought that some of the compounds that are created during this process might be either novel or better than the compounds that they started out as, right? It might create synergistic flavors that all of a sudden make the beer more aromatic or have better aromatics than it did previously. So I would say at best, it's a relatively poorly understood phenomenon. It depends on so many different variables that it's hard to nail down one particular case where it is doing this like one specific thing. However, there's plenty of research out there that does define certain mechanisms. And I think a couple of those that are worth mentioning that we see as really of high interest for brewers surround specific compounds like geraniol. So Sapporo has done some research based on the potential metabolism of geraniol into nerol and linalool, beta-citronellol and linalool, which are two other monoterpene alcohols. And the reason why that's significant is high levels of geraniol that are converted into these other two compounds. Potentially, their research showed that the combination of the three components together actually had an amplification effect of the aromatics of the beer rather than the geraniol on its own. So that's definitely a reason to pay attention to hops like Talus, Crystal, Centennial, Simcoe, Citra, other hops that are very high in geraniol, because there is the potential for those to be biotransformed in the fermentation process, given the right yeast sort of environment. Another one is 3-MH, which is a sulfur-bearing compound, 3-mercaptahexanol. That does, in certain scenarios, have the potential to be converted into 3-mercaptahexylacetate, 3-MHA, which is thought to be not only potentially better smelling, it tends to maybe take on a grapefruit and passion fruit type aroma, but also has a lower detection threshold. So that's the other thing, is the human nose can pick it up more easily potentially than 3-MH on its own. So the conversion process could actually create a more aromatic beer just by converting it into something that the human nose can pick up more, on an easier basis. So I put that all out there to say it is definitely not perfectly well understood, the scenarios in which biotransformation is or is not happening. Certain yeasts have a higher tendency for it than others. What I will say is you do yourself favors if you want to favor biotransformation. You do yourself favors by loading up your wort stream early with the raw materials to potentially make that happen. By raw materials, I would sort of point you towards the graph that we've made called the survivables chart that has a lot of reference to what we would call beer soluble compounds. So not everything in a hop is going to be able to be dissolved in beer. Some of them are hydrophobic and they're not going to want to be in beer. So they're not going to make it into the finished beer. So what we want to focus on specifically is beer soluble compounds that have the potential to remain in the wort stream and potentially be converted by yeast downstream. So some of those would be geraniol, linalool, methylgeranate, 2-methylbutyl isobutyrate, 3-MH, a few other beer soluble esters. Those are the things that we would, if you want to favor biotransformation, we would encourage you to seek out varieties that are going to favor those compounds and use them early in the process. So Whirlpool, Active Firm Dry Hop, things like that. So, all right, Pat, how did I do?
Did great. It is a poorly understood process because that's why it's called biotransformation, because it means stuff happens and we don't know why. So we just know you stick something in and something new comes out. That's basically why it got called that. So excellent job.
We do have a cryo blend that's a recent sort of beta project that we've been working on that was really originally designed to favor that activity. So it was deliberately designed to maximize the component concentrations of all those things that I just mentioned, sulfur-bearing components, monoterpene alcohols, beer-soluble esters, things like that. So if we've found so far, based on a lot of consumer testing and testing actually in the European market with some trustworthy brewers, that it tends to work very well. It seems to do what we hoped it would do, which is really amplify those flavors and supercharge your wort stream with those compounds. So it is. It seems to do what we think it's going. What we thought it would do. It was really a beta project at first. That was kind of a harebrained scheme that we cooked up, but it does seem to do very well. And we have so we created a lot more of that product for this year. So if anybody out there is looking for a product that could potentially maximize the biotransformation potential of their beer, I would encourage you to take a look at that blend. It's called Try 2304 CR. It's just a blend name at this point. We hope to give it a better name than that later on this year, but for now, that's what it's called. And some of your colleagues in Europe have that in the Belgium warehouse, I think, as we speak. So that'd be a good option to turn to if you want to potentially maximize that potential for biotransformation in your beer. So.
One other thing that's popped through, which is not necessarily associated with biotransformation, but is kind of along those same lines as kind of how do you get the most juice in your beer, and that is the question over double dry hopping and the various ways that can be interpreted, I should say.
So I've done a few double dry hop beers in my day. A lot of what I've seen is, I mean, obviously it's a bigger hop build that comes with it. I've seen the way I've done it in the past is doing an earlier dry hop, waiting a couple days, letting it do its thing, and then adding another dry hop, and you'll see differences in the way that those hops will kind of react throughout. But with that, it also does kind of speed up that hop creep. It gets everything going, and then it just kind of cleans it out for me. And that's where that kind of nice double dry hop flavor comes from. You add a little bit more, just get the pure aroma from it. And yeah, those are tasty.
You know what I'll mention on double dry hopping, we messed around with this a little bit, JT, is if you're not harvesting the yeast, getting like a T90 dry hop in right off the bat to jumpstart that hop creep real early is helpful. And then dry hopping later with cryo. For time, I'd say that's the fastest beers I think we've produced is doing it that way. But you know, if you're harvesting yeast, that's not gonna be sustainable for you unless you run a mother strain. You know, there was a question in one of the chats here. I just answered that. Yeah, how do you deal with yeast harvesting and dry hopping? It's like, well, you can warm harvest and get away with it. Best case is you have enough outlet for a non-dry hopped beer that you can, you know, use that to be your yeast propagator. And the dry hop beers, you really want to dry hop right. Maybe don't worry about harvesting. So. Spencer, could you, or Andy, could you guys chime in on what you're doing when you're harvesting and you're wanting to dry hop it, you know, with 6 Plato left to go? Are you harvesting at all?
The strains that I've used, I'm able to harvest at 5 Plato. I still get, I mean, we definitely have to pull more yeast than we want probably. And a lot of the tail end is pretty thin, I would say. We don't get a lot of generations out of it. I think that's the negative to dry hopping early. But I do have the ability to harvest day 4, day 5, 6, 7, 8 generations of what I've seen from these more like hazy IPA strains. So there is some negatives to it.
Do you think it's that terminal's just creeping up every harvest because you're getting a higher percentage of early flockers, or do you think it's just it's not a yeast health thing. It's what you're harvesting. I think
what you're harvesting, you're not getting the healthiest. You're not getting that middle, the healthy yeast. You're getting more of the early, like you said, the early flockers, and you get a good pitch, but it's just viability drops significantly throughout the generations.
Yeah, that is the one main downside of active firm dry hopping is it does create yeast management challenges, especially for smaller brewers who don't have the ability to prop up, new pitches in house and things like that. So there's different ways of tackling it. Some brewers just choose to build in the cost of a new pitch of yeast every time that they produce a new batch of these beers, just because they know that they can charge their end consumer and pass the cost on. Some people use dry yeast effectively, which is a little bit more cost effective than liquid yeast pitches. So they just, use a new brick of dry yeast every time. As Andy mentioned, some of these English strains that are used to, or English origin strains that are used to produce hazy IPAs like London L3 or London Fog or any of these, they tend to be pretty heavily flocculent, right? So you will get a fair amount of, you know, a fair yeast cake at the bottom, even at warm temperatures, you know, day 4, day 5, something like that. So you can get a pretty healthy pitch off the bottom. As Andy mentioned, though, there is a definite risk of it being in diminishing viability each time you use it, just because you're not getting, you're getting the early flockers in some cases, right? Which is not always the healthiest yeast. I would put it to the group that if anybody out there has the ability to top crop, that would be a great way to do it. Not many people have the ability to do that, but if you can find a creative way to top crop your yeast, I mean, the English have been doing that for hundreds of years with great success, right? And keeping their yeast healthy for that long. The thought process being that a lot of the healthiest cells are going to be in that Kreutzen, and they're going to be available to you to harvest at that point. That would kind of solve your issue, because you could harvest that on like day 1.5, day 2, you know, and you would have a great healthy pitch at that point that you could then reuse downstream and still be able to do your active firm dry hops. I realize from an equipment standpoint, not everybody has the ability to do that, but that's just food for thought for people out there if you wanted to get creative and try to do that. For some of you that maybe have open top fermenters, you could try skimming the top and actually doing some top cropping. But hopefully you're getting enough margin on these beers, these really high profile, heavily hop, double dry hop beers, that you could build in a little more cost for your yeast, and nobody will object because they're so delicious. So.
Yeah, I have a customer in my region that does the top cropping for these hazy IPAs, and what they do is they just overfill their fermenters, and then they just harvest yeast out of the CIP arm, and they just soft hose it into a small fermenter that they built into like a yeast harvesting, and they're at like generation 60, and they dry hop day 2, so they're harvesting like Spencer said day 1, day 1.5, dry hopping day 2, and their beers are some of the best in my region. So I mean, it can be done. You just gotta purchase some equipment, some extra hoses, and a small tank, but it definitely can be done.
Cool. Then I'll jump onto a couple of other questions that have popped up. So one is to do with the pH of beer. So could the pH influence the solubilization of hop compounds, and in which way?
In general, pH, as you increase pH, things become more soluble, especially like hop acids and many of the alcohols that you want for essentially flavored compounds like geraniol or linalool, because they have that little hydrogen group there with an alcohol that basically can easily be plucked off. So as soon as you increase the pH, you actually make it more soluble. So that's generally how pH can work. Of course, you can't go as high as we do in an advanced product to make it completely soluble, and you'll just create a different issue.
I'll chime in, and this isn't from a compounds perspective. This is from a sensory perspective and what I like to drink. I prefer finished beer, finished heavily dry hop beer to be, in that 4.7 or less range. And when you dry hop, the pH is it's gonna go up. Essentially, I mean, usually what we test when we go into the fermenter, and we're usually JT, around 5.2, if I remember right. And then it goes down as low as maybe 4.4, and then goes up. If we don't do any pH adjustment, it'll end up there for a big dry hop at 4.9. And that tends to kind of muddy up the beer and the hop snap for my perception. So we have more research we're going to do on that, but I really prefer to modify the pH going into the fermenter, so that just compensate for that big rise that we're going to get. And I think the higher the dosing, and Pat, you might know more on this, the higher the dosing, the higher the pH generally is going to go. So that's my opinion on it. And I have some other suspicions and I actually really want to do a project on this. So.
Yeah, essentially you're right. The more you put in, creates kind of a buffering and brings the pH back up. So that's why dry hopping always raises pH.
Awesome. And I'll jump. Go ahead.
I've noticed a little bit of acidulated malt in the malt bill has really kind of been helping make a consistent pH through my beers as well.
I'll add to that. That's a different subject than the hops. Definitely don't let your runoff, in my opinion, get above 5.7. You got to monitor that and cut it off early, and you're going to have a less grainy beer. Grainy flavor adds a harsh astringency that can be confused with hops. And I've encountered it. I haven't controlled pH historically. Like when I started brewing, I didn't know, but once I got a hang of it, man, with acidulated malts one method, acidifying your strike water is another, balancing your salts even another one. So there's all different methods and what your brew water to start with. So that is a critical step, is getting good runoff, good wort before you even touch it with hops. So yeah, acidulated malt, that's the easiest one on a small scale, just a couple percent. Yeah, I generally like to see 5.2 for the beginning of runnings, and 5.7, maybe 5.8 on a light beer. But if you get to 6, you're gonna taste it for sure.
Cool. The next one that we've got that cropped up a few times, and this is a question about reusing hops from a late stage dry hop as a bittering addition on a follow-up beer. Is this a thing?
I don't suggest it.
I've heard of people trying it. I think it's kind of neat, actually. It sounds extremely variable, though, is what I would say. Pat, you can speak to to what the alpha acid content of a hops coming out of the bottom of a dry hop fermenter would be like, but some of the acids are being dissolved during the dry hop process, so that the level of alpha acids that you have coming out of those hops when you get them out of the bottom of the fermenter is not going to be the same alpha acid content that you had of the original hops that you put in. So the predictability of what you're going to be bittering with, I think, is very low at that point, unless you have the ability to, you have a UV spec and you could test, what's coming out the bottom of the fermenter to know what you're dosing. It's a great thought on how to increase, the efficiency and lower the waste of your hops, but unless you have the ability to test what's coming out the bottom for alpha acid levels, I think you'd be in a pretty variable space. Pat, do you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, potentially it seems like, yeah, possible that you're not really extracting all the alpha acids out when you dry hop. So if you salvage that, you probably still have a good percentage there that you could easily use. But again, if you have the ability to analyze like Spencer, then you'd have a good way that you would know how to make that addition in the kettle or something. But you'd have a big mass to use because it's going to have a lot of water in it. So that'd be something you'd have to be willing to play with.
Most likely going to be some other stuff in there. I don't know anybody that does this. I've worked with a lot of the brewers. I mean, maybe if you were like in Antarctica and you had a brew system, really hard to get hops, but hopefully it's easier.
I actually saw a study a couple of years ago presented on that, and I can't remember the results, but it was about 3 years ago. I think it was from OSU, the Tom Shellhammer's group, actually.
Yeah, I think it's just consistency is the main worry for me there. Spencer kind of touched on it, of just not really knowing exactly what you're going to be pulling. Blaze kind of mentioned you might have some extra stuff in there. You're probably going to have a little bit of yeast. It's going to react different, probably batch to batch. And as we all know, as brewers, consistency is really the thing that we strive for. So that's kind of why I kind of tend to stay away from it.
Cool, thanks guys. Then I'm gonna round up with the last of the preloaded questions we've got here, and it's a bit of an expansive one. So, are there any kind of equipment factors that can drastically affect dry hopping? So, we had a lot of talk in the chat about recirculation, about pressurization, about use of hop guns. Also, just on the size of your tank. So, if you've got a 40 hect tank versus a 160 hect tank, what are the variables with these various methods?
I can talk a little bit. I've seen a lot of equipment out there. Me and Andy visited BrauCon, looked at where they make the hop guns, talked to them. My opinion, honestly, is I don't like recirculating fermented beer really much at all. And with the density of hops these days, I think the need for something to like emacerate or help dissolve the hop pellets is that needs much less. Really, I mean, for oxygen and dealing with safety with beer gushing, if you're dry hopping during active, you can't really beat a hop cannon, which is a device that essentially your tank needs to be set up for it. You got to have long sweeps so you don't plug stuff up, and bigger ports if possible. And shooting them to the top of the tank in a pressurized system is the best way for one, I would say for brewer safety. You're on the ground and you have a pressurized vessel, you shoot them to the top. It's a purge system. That's probably the best, but for me, I mean, generally 99% of the time I've done it. It's popping a port with some CO2 rousing from the bottom, dumping the hops in, and then capping it. During active fermentation, it's a little bit of a safety issue like we've talked about, and that's probably brew specific on how you deal with that. There is some, I haven't used them, but my friend Leandro in South America, he brews and he has what he calls a bazooka. And it's like, sure, some of your crew in Europe are using these things, but they put them on top of the tank, purge them. And it's like a valve on each side, add the hops and then cap it, open the valve at the bottom and then dump the hops in. I mean, it's kind of a similar theory to a hop cannon, but you don't need a really pressurized tank to do it. You're just dropping them into a pressurized tank if you want to. So I would like that, but the other option that I've used, if you don't have ports and it's hard to get in, you can make a slurry. It takes a little bit to dissolve the pellets, but definitely done that. I did that with one brewery on their pilot system. They had no ports, so we had to fill the keg with pellets, filled it with beer, let it dissolve, and then pumped it in there and roused, and it worked out great. But when we talked to BrowCon about the hop gun in particular, really their brewer, their team, they really like them to dissolve hop pellets. So it wasn't like turn it on for a day. It was more like just use it for a short period to get the hops. Once the pellets have dissolved, you don't really need to keep recirculating through that. But that's a good one, especially if you're dealing with any hard pellets, which you're most likely not going to be getting from Yakima Chief because we've lowered density spec so that they dissolve really easy. The flip side is they do float really easy at first, but there's some tricks to get them into solution if you got a floating layer, add some pressure to your tank. But sorry guys, I could go on and on about this. There's a lot of equipment out there to do this, but yeah, definitely I don't think with how our pellets are, our Cryo or T90, I don't think you really need anything that's fully just to break them up. But yeah, if you have a hop gun, I'd recommend, probably pump it through. Once the hops are dissolved, just no need to keep pumping. But Spencer, Andy, you might know more. You have brewers. I know there's some on the East Coast that do a lot of recirculating of hops for, in my experience, when I've had beers with that, it usually increases the vegetal flavor by tearing up the hops a little bit. So, why I like using Cryo to have less.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion on it is less is more when it comes to dry hopping machinery. I think a bigger impetus for me to use a hop cannon or something like what Blaze is talking about would be safety rather than beer quality. I think when you reach a certain point of tank size, it becomes an unsafe proposition to get hundreds and hundreds of pounds to the top of that tank and stuff like that. So I think that would be a bigger impetus for me to use a hop cannon than the beer quality itself. I think you can make a very, very high quality beer with the very traditional method of just dumping them in and getting them into solution. My preferred method of recirculation when I was a brewer was just bubbling with CO2, using a CO2 nipple at the bottom of the tank and bubbling the hops up, using CO2 bubbles for maybe 30 minutes, mostly just because it was a very gentle form of agitation and it didn't require a lot of extra equipment or extra sanitary procedures or extra labor. I do really feel strongly that less is more when it comes to recirculation. When people talk about circulating for 24 hours, 48 hours, I worry about that as a potential for a lot of pump shear and a lot of maybe potential oxygen ingress and just the beating up of the beer. So my advice would be, if you are going to recirculate, continually knock that time down until you start to see less flavor pickup, right? And then that's the point at which you stop. If 12 hours is getting you good flavor, try 8 hours. If 8 hours is still getting you good flavor, try 6 hours, try 4 hours, try 2 hours, and stop where you see flavor pickup start to diminish. That's the point at which you do it. So do it at the bare minimum amount of time, and then just let the beer do what it'll do, because more is not better, I don't think, when it comes to the use of machinery with dry hopping. Andy, do you agree with that?
Yeah, 100%. I agree with everything you guys I've tasted beers that have been recirced that have been through a hop doser and hop cannon, and that when you're recircing, like Blaze said, you're kind of you're just pulling out more of the polyphenol content, and the beers just have like a little stronger, like woody, grassy flavor. So I know some really well-known breweries that do it. If you guys wanted to do it, I would just, like Spencer said, start at a, the minimal amount of time and then increase from there. Don't go in doing it for 2 days. Start low and then increase.
Awesome. Well, that's kind of hit the end of our time window for this one. So what I will say is huge thank you to all of the guys for joining us bright and early in the States. Thanks to my colleague Pierrick for passing me all the questions from the chat as well. Sorry we didn't get a chance to answer everything, but what we're going to do is this video is going to be archived onto our YouTube channel. We're going to be sending some bits and pieces out, and we've got an archive of the chat. So we're going to do our best to, after this has happened, to answer as many of these questions as we possibly can do, and send a bit of a thank you email out to everyone for attending in the next couple of days. And yeah, so that's the big one. So thanks everyone, and yeah, we'll see you soon.
Thanks everybody.
Everyone.
See you.
Cheers.
See ya.
Cheers.